Think about this honestly. What happens to most men after marriage? Their friend group shrinks or disappears entirely. Their hobbies become selfish unless they serve the family unit. Their free time gets absorbed into household management and family obligations. Their money stops being their money and becomes our money, with the woman typically controlling how it gets spent. This isn't happening by accident. It's happening by design. Women intuitively understand that a man's value to the family unit increases when his options outside that unit decrease. The fewer alternatives he has, the more resources he'll dedicate to maintaining the relationship. So, piece by piece, choice by choice, his independent life gets dismantled until he's psychologically and economically trapped. The genius of this system is that it uses the man's own values against him. His desire to be a good husband, a reliable provider, a loving father. These noble impulses become the very chains that bind him. He collaborates in his own imprisonment because resistance feels selfish and irresponsible. The psychologist Carl Jung once wrote, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." But for many married men, the most terrifying thing is to recognize how completely they've been domesticated. Look at the language we use. Ball and chain, getting hitched, taking the plunge. Even our casual expressions reveal an unconscious awareness that marriage represents a loss of freedom, not a gain of partnership. But here's where it gets really dark. The system doesn't just exploit men. It's designed to make them grateful for the exploitation. The concept of happy wife, happy life isn't folk wisdom. It's psychological programming that trains men to prioritize a woman's emotional state over their own needs, desires, and well-being. This creates a fundamental power imbalance where one person's happiness becomes the primary goal, while the other person's happiness becomes conditional on achieving that goal. It's not partnership, it's servitude with better marketing. The philosopher Schopenhauer observed that a man can be himself only so long as he is alone. Marriage systematically eliminates the solitude and independence that allow men to maintain their authentic identity. They gradually become what their wife needs them to be, rather than who they actually are. The transformation happens so slowly that most men don't even notice until it's complete. They start making small compromises, skipping guy's night to keep the peace, choosing her preferred restaurant to avoid conflict, deferring to her judgment on social plans. Each compromise seems reasonable in isolation, but collectively they represent a complete surrender of personal agency. Meanwhile, women's behavior in marriage follows a predictable pattern that reveals the underlying biological programming. During the courtship phase, they maximize their appeal. Frequent sex, shared interests, minimal demands, maximum agreeability. After securing commitment, the dynamic gradually reverses. Sex becomes a reward for good behavior rather than an expression of desire. Shared interests become irrelevant if they don't serve family goals. Demands increase while agreeability decreases. The woman who was once eager to please becomes entitled to be pleased. This isn't conscious manipulation, it's evolutionary programming. Women are biologically wired to secure resources and commitment, then optimize the arrangement for maximum benefit. The man who doesn't understand this programming becomes its victim. Here's the brutal reality that most men refuse to accept. Your wife's love is fundamentally conditional. It's based on your utility, not your intrinsic worth. The moment you stop providing value, whether through income loss, health problems, or simply becoming too familiar, that love begins to evaporate. The topic of divorce statistics prove this point. Women initiate 70 to 80% of divorces. They do it when the cost-benefit analysis of the marriage shifts in their favor. They don't leave because they're unhappy. They leave because they can get better terms elsewhere or have extracted maximum value from the current arrangement. The family court system completes the exploitation by ensuring that even divorce doesn't free the man from his resource extraction obligations. Alimony, child support, and asset division guarantee that he continues paying for a family structure he can no longer access or benefit from. But here's where the situation becomes truly psychological warfare. Modern marriage doesn't just exploit men economically. It destroys them psychologically by attacking their fundamental sense of identity and purpose. The married man learns that his thoughts, feelings, and desires matter less than maintaining domestic harmony. His role becomes reactive rather than proactive. He exists to solve problems, provide solutions, and absorb emotional burdens. This creates what psychologists call learned helplessness, a condition where repeated exposure to uncontrollable stress causes people to stop trying to escape. Even when escape becomes possible, the married man stops asserting his needs because experience has taught him that resistance only creates more problems. He develops what I call domestic Stockholm syndrome, identifying with his captor's goals and defending the system that exploits him. He tells himself that sacrifice equals love, that his discomfort is selfish, that real men put family first, no matter the personal cost. The most insidious part of this programming is how it's reinforced by society. Media celebrates the family man who sacrifices everything for his wife and children. Religion teaches that selflessness is a virtue and that men should love their wives as Christ loved the church, through complete self-sacrifice. Even other men reinforce this programming. Married men can't admit the reality of their situation without acknowledging their own psychological defeat, so they perpetuate the myth that marriage is partnership while living the reality that it's servitude. The tragedy isn't that women exploit these dynamics. It's that men are so unprepared for them. Society teaches men to be providers and protectors without teaching them to protect themselves from the very people they're providing for. Here's what no one tells young men about marriage. The moment you make a woman your primary source of happiness, validation, and meaning, you've already lost. You've handed over your psychological sovereignty to someone whose biological programming prioritizes her needs over yours. This doesn't make women evil. It makes them female. Their behavior follows predictable patterns because those patterns worked for millions of years of human evolution. The women who could successfully extract resources from men reproduced more successfully than those who couldn't. But evolution didn't prepare women to care about men's psychological well-being or individual fulfillment. It prepared them to secure survival and reproductive advantage. Modern marriage gives them legal and social tools to pursue these goals with unprecedented efficiency. The man who understands this reality stops taking female behavior personally and starts responding strategically. He recognizes that marriage isn't about love, it's about leverage, and the person with more options always has more leverage. Schopenhauer wrote, "All satisfaction, or what is commonly called happiness, is really and essentially always negative only and never positive." He understood that true contentment comes not from getting what you want from others, but from not needing anything from others to feel complete. This principle destroys the fundamental premise of modern marriage, that happiness comes from partnership and shared life goals. The man who needs marriage to feel fulfilled has already surrendered his power. The man who views marriage as optional maintains his sovereignty. But here's where most men make their fatal error. They believe they can negotiate or earn their way out of these dynamics through better behavior. They think if they just communicate more effectively, provide more resources, or become more attractive, the fundamental power structure will change in their favor. This is like trying to negotiate with gravity. You're not dealing with conscious choices. You're dealing with biological imperatives that operate below the level of awareness. Women don't choose to optimize their relationships for maximum benefit any more than men choose to find young, fertile women attractive. The only winning move is not to play by rules that guarantee your defeat. Here's the dark secret that successful men understand but never publicly acknowledge. The moment you become indispensable to a woman's lifestyle, you become dispensable as a person. She stops seeing you as an individual with needs, desires, and dreams. You become a function, provider, protector, problem solver, emotional absorber. This functional relationship might look like marriage from the outside, but it's actually sophisticated slavery with occasional sexual benefits. The man provides labor and resources, while the woman manages the household and controls access to affection. It's efficient, but it's not partnership. The psychological toll of this arrangement explains why married men die younger, have higher rates of depression, and often seem like shadows of their former selves. They're not suffering from normal life stress. They're suffering from chronic psychological exploitation, disguised as love. But society won't acknowledge this reality because the entire economic system depends on men's willingness to sacrifice their individual fulfillment for family obligations. The man who prioritizes his own happiness over family duty threatens the social order that requires male sacrifice to function. This is why men who question marriage are labeled selfish, immature, or commitment phobic. The system can't survive honest analysis, so it uses shame and social pressure to prevent men from thinking clearly about the transaction they're entering. Here's where Schopenhauer's philosophy becomes revolutionary. The safest way of not being very miserable is not to expect to be very happy. Applied to relationships, this means not expecting marriage to provide happiness, fulfillment, or unconditional love. When you eliminate these expectations, you eliminate the disappointment that destroys most men's psychological well-being. You start evaluating marriage like any other contract, based on terms, costs, and benefits, rather than emotions and social expectations. You ask yourself, what am I getting from this arrangement? What am I giving up? And is this trade beneficial to my long-term interests? Most men never ask these questions because they've been programmed to believe that love transcends practical considerations. But love fades, emotions change, and people's needs evolve. The marriage contract remains binding regardless of how anyone feels about it. The man who approaches relationships strategically rather than emotionally maintains his power throughout the interaction. He doesn't surrender his independence, hoping to receive loyalty in return. He doesn't sacrifice his identity, expecting to be appreciated for it. He doesn't make someone else responsible for his happiness and then resent them when they inevitably fail to deliver. This strategic mindset requires developing what Schopenhauer called the art of not being deceived. You must learn to recognize the difference between what women say and what they actually respond to. They claim to want sensitive, emotionally available men who prioritize their feelings, but their behavior consistently rewards men who prioritize their own mission and maintain emotional independence. Watch how women treat men through various forms of pressure and manipulation. The man who consistently fails these tests by prioritizing her emotions over his own principles loses her respect and attraction. The man who passes these tests by maintaining his boundaries and priorities earns her ongoing investment and effort. She doesn't consciously choose to respect strength over weakness. Her biology makes this choice for her. This is why "nice guys finish last" isn't just a bitter saying. It's a biological law. Niceness signals genetic weakness, emotional neediness, and a lack of options. These qualities trigger disgust rather than attraction as in women's evolutionary programming. But here's the crucial distinction most men miss. Being strong doesn't mean being cruel. Being independent doesn't mean being indifferent. Being selective doesn't mean being abusive. The psychologically sovereign man can be kind without being weak, generous without being taken advantage of, and loving without losing himself in the process. He gives from a place of abundance rather than neediness, which makes his gifts genuinely valuable rather than burdensome. This transformation requires killing the part of yourself that seeks validation from others. You must become so internally complete that external approval becomes irrelevant to your sense of self-worth. You must develop purposes so compelling that relationship drama seems trivial by comparison. The journey to this psychological sovereignty is brutal and lonely. You'll face years of social pressure to conform, to settle, to accept arrangements that don't serve your highest good. You'll watch other men surrender their dreams for domestic comfort while society celebrates their maturity. But on the other side of this inner work lies something most men never experience: the ability to engage with women from a position of strength rather than neediness. When you don't need anything from them, you can appreciate what they genuinely offer without resenting what they can't provide. You can love without attachment, care without controlling, and engage without losing yourself in the process. This is the difference between relationships built on mutual enhancement versus mutual dependency. The marriage industrial complex survives by convincing men that independence equals loneliness and that sacrifice equals love. But independence doesn't equal loneliness. It equals choice. And sacrifice doesn't equal love. It equals transaction. Real love enhances both parties without diminishing either. It creates energy rather than consuming it. It expands possibilities rather than limiting them. It celebrates individual growth rather than demanding conformity. These relationships are rare precisely because they require two psychologically complete individuals rather than two people trying to use each other to fill internal voids. Most people aren't willing to do the inner work required for this level of consciousness. But for the man who develops this psychological sovereignty, marriage becomes a choice rather than a necessity. He can engage with it if it genuinely enhances his life, or avoid it if the terms don't serve his interests. Either way, he remains free. Schopenhauer's ultimate insight wasn't about the nature of women or marriage. It was about the possibility of transcending biological programming through conscious awareness. When you understand the forces that control most humans, you can choose whether to be controlled by them. The final word and call to action, the red pill, isn't about becoming bitter or cynical about relationships. It's about loving truth enough to rebuild your life according to reality, rather than comfortable illusions. It's about developing the strength to stand alone so you can choose to stand together. This is where your real life begins. Not when you finally get what you think you want from others, but when you no longer need anything from anyone to be complete. The strong don't avoid relationships because they hate connection. They demand relationships that match their level of psychological development. And in that philosophical sovereignty, they discover a strength that attracts the rare individuals who actually deserve their presence, not because they need validation, but because they choose connection, not because they're desperate, but because they're abundant. The choice is yours. You can continue accepting whatever terms others offer because you're afraid of being alone, or you can build such a compelling life that others compete for access to it. One path leads to psychological slavery disguised as love. The other leads to genuine freedom that makes authentic love possible. The difference between these paths isn't luck or circumstances, it's consciousness and courage. Choose wisely. Your future self depends on it.